Drum beats don't sound like they used to, and there's a simple reason for that: the stack. There's a long history of inventions changing the way people play drums. From the lowboy evolving into the hi-hat, to the snare drum being used for the backbeat, to quantization in drum machines, to electronica. And this change is, in my humble opinion, on par with those. But it's also different. From the early days of rock and roll, drummers have caught the backbeat on the snare. Sure, snare sounds have changed. Subdivisions have changed. Drummers have invented a ton of things to do around the backbeat. But the backbeat remained largely on the snare. But this is different. Because it's the first time another instrument has replaced the snare as the backbeat. And there's a reason that's so revolutionary. Because it now frees the snare up to do other things. Love them or hate them, stacks have fundamentally changed the options available to us on the drums. I'm Nate, people call me the 80/20 drummer, and today on the channel we're going to explore this new family of grooves. And the musical options not having to catch the backbeat on the snare frees up. And if you stick around to the end, I'll play some specific grooves you can learn, which are made possible because of this sea change in drumming. And as usual, the grooves we explain will all be transcribed for you for free download at the link below the player. What does it mean that the snare drum isn't the locus of the backbeat anymore? And how can you use that to enhance the music you make? Stay tuned. Let's start with why this is happening now. Chapter 1. Why now? We've had a ton of auxiliary instruments added to the drum kit over the years, and we've featured a lot of them on the channel. Bongos on the kick drum. Snoms. Zill bells. Bells on the snare and toms. Why didn't any of those inventions change the direction of drumming as massively as I'd argue these stacks are? Actually, let's go through a brief history of the backbeat. I googled this. One place we might situate the idea for the backbeat is in late 19th century, early 20th century worship music in black churches. There weren't drums per se, but what there were people clapping. This will become important. Throughout the evolution of early 20th century music around New Orleans, drummers hinted at the backbeat with beats like the second line beat, which often features press rolls in 2 and 4, among other funky places. I copied this verbatim from search results. The Encyclopedia of Percussion cites Good Rockin' Tonight from 1948 by Wynonie Harris as an early hit with a consistent backbeat on 2 and 4. I heard the news, there's good rockin' tonight. Nate again, then we all have the rock precursor music we know and love. Little Richard, later the Beatles, etc. By this point, drummers are playing the backbeat, and the snare has become the focus. And it's hard to beat the snare. Snare gives it that little buzz. And the shallow depth and metal rims made it project so it could carry above an amplified band. And let's just pause. From here on out, nothing really displaces the snare as the center of the backbeat. We get plenty of variations of rock, soul, and funk, from halftime to swung to train beats. All still with the snare as the centerpiece. In the 70s, we get Mike Clark and Harvey Mason moving the snare beat around. Reminiscent of some of those New Orleans drummers, especially Ziggy from the Meters. But never a change of instrument or role. Through the rock traditions, we also get the inclusion of toms around the snare beat. Which probably came from the jazz influence of drummers like Art Blakey and Max Roach. which has a through line to Mitch Mitchell, Ginger Baker, the drums of Creedence Clearwater Revival, then Bonham, Keith Moon, Bill Ward, through into punk rock, then alternative rock with drummers like Dave Grohl and Matt Cameron. And now Tom Flo is ubiquitous in live arrangements. Again, still landing on the snare on 2 and 4. We had reggae and steppers beats, which influenced 90s electronica beats like jungle and drum and bass,
Let me hit you straight.
which human drummers like Jojo Mayer adopted, which are now ubiquitous, and you see practically everybody doing in the modern era, from Chris Dave to J.D. Beck to Russell Holtzman. Still landing on the snare. Then there was the whole stuff on the drums trend, which continues. Here's Nate Wood from like last week. Snare still catching the backbeat. So, after all that history, all those inventions, there was one constant. Nothing displaced the snare as the best place to place the backbeat. Snoms, honorable mention, but it's really also a snare, sorry. Which means that any accent you played on the snare would be interpreted as a backbeat. So you couldn't really migrate the accents too much. Until now. Chapter 2, why the stack? This little warped washer-shaped stack of cymbals seems an unlikely culprit to unseat the snare drum. Indeed, why not one of the toms or a gong drum or something? Well, if you'll indulge me in a little rewind effect, we have to go back, all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. Remember the origin of it all? Or my hypothesis, at least? The humble hand clap. Indeed, it may have been the hand clap that the snare was imitating at the beginning, combined with some marching rhythms. And here's the thing about the hand clap. It's kind of a hard sound to synthesize. It's not until the invention of basic synthesizers that we start getting the clap effect in drum machine beats. But the clap already has a lot of advantages. It's more trebly than the snare, so it cuts above vocals well. It's also thinner, so it's ideal for verses, or parts of the arrangement where the beat isn't the heaviest. By the early 2000s, synth pads were becoming a thing, and for the first time, you started to see the clap displacing the snare as a backbeat on the drum kit. Here's a famous clip of Spanking using the synth pad. But synth pads are expensive and heavy, and require electronics and amplification. What if somebody could invent an acoustic device that could fit in any cymbal bag that would do the same thing? In 2018, a drummer named Trevor Lawrence did just that. This humble stack of wafer-thin cymbals that looks like it got too close to the forge produces a sound like a hand clap, which is about the right volume for an acoustic drum kit, which you can also adjust, depending on the size and number of cymbals in the stack, how tightly you clamp it, and at what angle you play. Now you had an acoustic instrument, easily portable, which didn't require cables, preamps, mixing boards, anything. Just put it on the stand and bang. And for the first time in mainstream drumming, the snare drum was kind of relieved of duty. Chapter 3, so what now? I should interject that you can make your own version of one of these by just experimenting with combinations of wet and dry cymbals in your bag, if you're not in the position to go out and buy one, that is. But now let's explore some of the grooves we can make with this stack. The first species is just moving what we do on the snare over to the stack. So if we're doing a simple backbeat funk, we just hit the stack instead of the snare. Little swung or New Jack style beat. A reminder, all of these grooves will be transcribed for you below the player. And all of those live arrangement tom grooves can also land with the backbeat on the stack. But check out what Noah Feuerbringer is doing here. He's including the snare. And now that the snare doesn't have the responsibility for the backbeat, he can play accents on the snare in non-backbeat places. Let's try this. Here's a straight 16th groove with the snare embellishing. And here's a swung one. Finally, something I've been exploring. You can share the backbeat duties between the snare and the stack. Let's take a beat I call Clave 2, for reasons. See this video here. But the hip thing is to play odd beats on the snare and even ones on the stack. Let's take another backbeat, which has 3 accents. We can alternate between the stack and the snare, and it makes a 4-bar pattern. If we check out more and more of the creative drumming of modern drummers, I'd make the case that the stack is here to stay. And that it's changed how drummers will play grooves going forward, in a way no other invention since the snare drum really has. Of course, the snare drum will always have a place, but for now, for the first time, drummers have another option.
And that's how you get the gig!
Well, I think this is another one that's going to engender a little bit of controversy. Feel free to leave a polite comment below. And just a reminder, you can get the complete transcription of all the grooves from this lesson by clicking the link below the player and telling us where to send it. Dudes, this will always enjoy these. See you again real soon in another Lesson of the Week.